Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 847, and today is October 20th, 2025. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. I want to mix it up a little bit today. I'm trying to kind of play around with new formats for the show to make it a little bit more engaging. So if you like what I got going on today, please leave a comment in the YouTube section. The channel, of course, is Conflicts of Interest, very easy to find. And, let me know. If you're not on YouTube, you could always leave a post under the video when I post on X. My handle is at @KyleAnzalone_. Really been battling the Twitter algorithm over the past 2 months. I've been about 25 followers away from 10,000, and every time I get within 15, I get bumped back down to about 9,950, and then I have to work my way back up to 980 before I get back bumped back down again. So maybe if I get a big boost and just clear the hurdle fairly quickly, it'll kind of break whatever algorithm that I locked in where I can't seem to get the traction that I'm going for. All right, everybody. With that, we will get into today's episode. All right, so we're going to start off today in South America. Trump orders CIA to conduct covert lethal operations in Venezuela. Now, kind of the way I'm thinking of doing this show is I'll bring up my article, kind of say the headline, do a little bit of summary, not just what's in this article, but all the recent news on the particular topic, and then get into the analysis. So I believe we have 5 or 6 now lethal strikes on vessels that were leaving Venezuela. The U.S. claims that these are drug boats that are smuggling narcotics into the U.S. that are killing Americans. Absolutely nobody believes this is true. Not even the Atlantic says that this is true, which is kind of a crazy statement to make, that the Atlantic is actually kind of undermining the president's war propaganda on this issue, because a very small amount of the drugs coming into the U.S. come through the Caribbean or the Atlantic coast. I think 93%, almost all of it, ends up coming up the Pacific coast, mainly originating, I think at this point, from Ecuador, less even from Colombia. At this point, I think Peru is a fairly major producer and exporter of these drugs. Now, when you look particularly at the drugs that are killing Americans, we look mostly here at fentanyl and heroin, not necessarily cocaine, which I believe is about the 7% of drugs that do come from Venezuela is just cocaine. That hasn't been mixed or laced with fentanyl because it hasn't gone through Mexico, which is where the cartels are loading the cocaine up with the fentanyl and the heroin up with the fentanyl. That's causing all the overdoses. And so the pretext put forward by the Trump administration that this is somehow about saving the lives of Americans by preventing drug smuggling just simply isn't true. Now, another really important point to all of this is Maduro has shown and has said that he's willing to work with the Americans on this. When Trump first came into office, his hostage envoy, his crisis envoy, Rick Grenell, traveled to Venezuela, met with Maduro, loaded a plane up with 6 American captives, and went back to the U.S. This seemed to me, I thought that this was a good sign for U.S.-Venezuelan relations during the Trump administration for two reasons here. One, I think it showed that there was somebody in the Trump administration with a common sense approach to Venezuela, which is really important. And at the time, my analysis was this seems like it's going to go one of two directions. Either Trump's personal envoys, Rick Grenell, Steve Witkoff, Adam Boehler, are going to handle his foreign policy, or Marco Rubio is. And if it's Grenell, good to go on Venezuela, no worried about regime change, intervention, war there. If it's Rubio, a lot of reason to worry. And so it seems that Rubio has won the day there, and what I thought was good news just, turned out to be Trump making another blunder, handing his foreign policy over to the neoconservatives, allowing Marco Rubio, a notorious Venezuela Latin America hawk who has all these insane ideas on reshaping South America. This is going to cause a major migration crisis into the United States. I'm sure any kind of destabilization in Venezuela is not going to lead to less drug smuggling, but more, right? This is going the opposite direction that President Trump wants, particularly on the migration and the immigration issue, getting into a conflict in Latin America. And so rather than going with his personal envoy, Rick Grenell, who I think could have had a common sense way of dealing with this and had taken Trump down a path that would have not led him into another foreign policy blunder, but also would have helped his domestic policy in. I'm sure Maduro would have been willing to work to curb the little of the drug smuggling that is coming through Venezuela to the extent that he is capable. And it helps with the domestic migration crisis because Venezuela was willing to take back any Venezuelan migrants who are here in the U.S. illegally. Then the other sign I thought was positive is Maduro seemed to understand the game. Trump had come into office and, I'm not trying to play too much into this whole idea that we just saw these major no kings protests over the weekend. This just seemed like establishment Democrat protests to me. Nothing that we should be particularly excited about. But I do think that Trump, when he took office, viewed himself as a king. And he was basically demanding that everybody do what you do when a new king comes in. Everybody comes, bows the knee, offers up some sort of trinket or gift or pledge or some way of celebrating the new king, right? Like that seemed pretty clearly to me what Trump was doing during his first few weeks in office. And Maduro understood this and offered up 6 Americans, didn't ask for anything in return. Just, here you go, let's get this off on the right foot. So we're moving in the right direction. Then Rubio just starts agitating, gaining influence, listing all of these Latin American cartels, and initially not Venezuelan cartels, but then it does expand to Venezuelan cartels. Then we start in September the strikes on Venezuelan boats. Now we see Trump authorizing covert CIA action in Venezuela. And a part of me thinks that maybe this isn't that big of a deal. Maybe Trump is just trying to intimidate Maduro, trying to get his government to collapse, which I do think would be a disaster for the United States, even if it doesn't involve the U.S. actually taking out Maduro. I do think it will be a disaster for the United States to have Maduro fall in a way that, there's probably a way that it could be done, that Maduro could leave power, that it wasn't bad for the United States of America and Americans dealing with a migration crisis, more poverty, more instability in our own hemisphere, and from a major player. I think people like to play down the importance of Venezuela, but Venezuela is a populous country with a lot of natural reserves, a lot of rainforest. It's a difficult terrain, so I don't think we should just, simply think that this is like an unimportant country or something like that, at least like Iraq. And we saw kind of the regional fallout from that, and we'll certainly see a major regional fallout from this as well. If there really is a true groundswell populist uprising in Venezuela where a group of people, kind of forced Maduro out of power, they set up their own civilian government, well, then maybe, we don't see a major migration crisis, a lot of instability in the region, things like that. If it's an artificial American-made regime change, which is certainly the direction that we seem to be going at this point in time. So this is going to be a disaster for the U.S. And man, I really wish Trump wasn't going down this path, but I really don't see him walking away from this path at this point, at least not as long as Marco Rubio is his Secretary of State. During the first administration, we saw a lot of turnover, a lot of changes in policy, and at times, Trump was willing to walk away from the brink. And so, maybe there's a chance here that what is happening is, Trump is bullying Maduro. He thinks that, if we fly B-52s close to Venezuela, if we plant a story in the New York Times saying that the CIA could assassinate Maduro, Maduro will say, I got a good amount of money. I got a nice life. As much as I like being president of Venezuela, this is getting a little bit difficult. Putin says I could go live in Moscow and buy some nice condos in Russian tourist regions and just live like kind of a nice, peaceful life somewhere else in the world. That's not going to happen. This seems like an absolute and insane fantasy. And so what happens when that fantasy comes up with reality, when Maduro doesn't leave? It seems likely that we're going to at least start strikes inside of Venezuela against maybe not the Venezuelan government, but certainly cartel factions. But when that doesn't work, what's the next step? Is Trump going to get frustrated with Rubio? Maybe Trump gets mad at Rubio because he gets a bad haircut and fires him next week. I don't know, but I certainly wouldn't count on that. And as long as Rubio is Secretary of State, I see no reason that this policy isn't going to continue to ratchet up towards war directly against Venezuela. I'm not sure that we're, within days or weeks or something like that of direct U.S. strikes on the Venezuelan government, but certainly months, sometime next year, maybe we could see this war get to that point in time. My next fear is that we end up starting strikes inside of Venezuelan territory that doesn't work and maybe invite some retaliation. All right, next up here, another article I wrote for JudgeNap.com. Trump says $20 billion bailout for Argentina depends on Milei election victory. And so, I want to write up this story in part because Milei has gotten this reputation as a libertarian hero for some libertarians here in the U.S. And it seemed fairly obvious to me from the beginning that he probably wasn't as solid of a libertarian as people made him say. Oh, he read Rothbard, as somehow means that not only did he read the book, but he guides all of his philosophy on it. I mean, it is just an absurd leap to make, but a lot of people made that leap. And look, there was some good rhetoric, and I think a lot of it was maybe a little bit more performative and gaining a lot of attention, and that worked, right? He's a successful politician, but successful politicians don't often implement policy well. And I don't know enough about the Venezuelan or Argentinian economy to really weigh in and say, oh, he's done some really good things, he's done some really bad things on these particular issues. But the Argentine economy is now in trouble. Milei's party is going to kind of have a rough time in these upcoming midterms. And so Trump is trying to bribe the Argentinian people with $20 billion or up to $40 billion to re-elect Milei's party. He says, we'll give you the bailout if his party's in leadership. We're not going to give you the bailout if they're not. I mean, this is just kind of baseline level election meddling. The only thing that's kind of good about it is, Trump being Trump. He just is so transparent about the real goals here. All right, so next up here, Trump urged Zelensky to accept deal and end the war. So this was an article that was published in the Financial Times, and it was, I think, the Ukrainian take. This is kind of me reading between the lines because they don't name who their sources are generally. But this is, my understanding is the Financial Times talked to either the Ukrainian officials who were at the meeting or European officials who were told about the meeting by Ukrainian officials. And so this is the Ukrainian take. They say that Trump was cursing and screaming and throwing maps off table and just repeating that nasty old Putin's talking points during the whole meeting. It seems like really Trump delivered. So this is what we've been talking about on the show for a couple months now. We've had all this rhetoric from Donald Trump. Ukraine could win the war. Russia's a paper tiger. And we've had Trump, say the Russian economy is in trouble. We're going to tariff Russia's trading partners. Russia's in big trouble. And not only that, there's actually been a little bit of concrete action behind it, with the U.S. helping Ukraine to hit Russian refineries far from the front lines. We're helping to design the routes that the Ukrainian drones are taking. And the CIA is probably producing the drones. So these are just essentially American operations blowing up in causing fires and other infrastructure problems at Russian refineries. And so this has happened over the past few months. And I think there was a real belief among some that Donald Trump had really gotten frustrated with Vladimir Putin and decided that, what? It's time to just go and back Ukraine. And there was some concern, even from me, that he was just going to adopt the Biden policy. The other possibility was this was the art of the deal, that Trump was bluffing, that he's talking about tomahawks, and some of it's not just bluffing, right? There is like actual kinetic action happening with the drones, but Trump never really intended to take it as far as he was publicly saying. He didn't think that Ukraine could win the war. He probably doesn't think the Ukrainians could go on the offensive. He doesn't think the Russians are a paper tiger. He doesn't think the Russian economy is about to collapse. Those were all messages intended for Vladimir Putin, right? He wanted Vladimir Putin to believe that the Americans were on the verge of ramping up their support for Ukraine, that Russia's trading partners were on the verge of abandoning Moscow, that Putin, if he elected to continue this war and not make a more reasonable deal with Zelensky, could potentially lose the war. That was the message that Donald Trump was saying to Vladimir Putin, and was a bluff. Putin called the bluff. He never believed it. He understands Trump and the art of the deal just like most of us do now. At the time this was happening, I was saying my concern is that Putin doesn't believe it, but Zelensky does, right? And that's the problem. If you're like bluffing, like you got this great hand, and somebody is betting on you to win because they don't know that you're bluffing, they're going to lose a lot. And that's what happened, I think, to Zelensky. And so he goes into this meeting, chest pumped out, maybe riding a little high, a little bit extra energy and pep in his step. And he goes into the White House, and he's got these maps, and he's talking about Tomahawk missiles and how if we hit them here and here and here, we can make this major advance and we can win this war, and Putin will be out, and this is going to go so well. And Trump tells him he's delusional, that this is never going to happen, that they're not going to get Tomahawk missiles, that they're losing this war. As he publicly said in February, you don't have the cards. So my guess is that this is what's happened at the meeting. Now, Zelensky, I don't think, heard this and went, oh, like, I really miscalculated here. My advisors told me that Trump was really shifting on Ukraine. And now I really got to reassess and maybe go home and rethink and make a deal with Vladimir Putin. It seems like, and this is judging by the Financial Times article and kind of the leads that we've gotten, is that the Ukrainians are going to start, and the Europeans are going to start, and the pro-Ukrainian factions in the United States are going to start going again. Oh, Trump just loves Vladimir Putin. He's Putin's puppet. He's owned by Vladimir Putin. Why does Trump love Putin so much? What does Putin have on Donald Trump? We're going to hear that day after day after day after day. And rather than making a deal that will end this war, that will preserve some sovereignty for Ukraine, most of Ukraine's territory, Zelensky is going to choose to fight the propaganda war in the United States and think that he could eventually push Donald Trump into giving Ukraine enough support to win the war. It doesn't exist. It's simply, on multiple levels, it doesn't exist. I don't think that this is something that Barack Obama and Antony Blinken identified in the 2010s, right? That Russia maintains escalation dominance in Ukraine. As easy as it would be to say, oh, we give them Tomahawk missiles and all these other advanced systems, and look how well they fought already. Imagine if they had top tier NATO equipment and another 100,000 troops, they would beat the Russians in a week. No, Russia has nuclear weapons. That it doesn't work that way, right? Russia has fought this war I think somewhat understanding and intentionally in a matter understanding that they're going to have to live next to millions of Ukrainians after this war, many of whom will be radicalized by the conflict, and they're not looking to just create wanton destruction in Ukraine. But they can, and they would, to prevent losing. And you have to understand that. And Zelensky has to understand that. And Trump has to understand that. And Zelensky certainly doesn't. And I don't know about Donald Trump. But it doesn't seem to be going in a good direction. Now, another issue is just logistics. And this is something that Trump has brought up and that I've been yelling about for years now. There simply aren't enough Western weapons to defeat the Russians. Right? We've stretched our stockpiles so thin. We've spent tens of billions of dollars trying to ramp up Western weapons production, and it's not matching the Russian Western production's capability. And so even if Israel wasn't conducting a genocide in Gaza, even if the US wasn't about to fight a war against Venezuela, even if we weren't worried about arming up Taiwan and maintaining a large military presence in the Indo-Pacific, I'm not quite sure that we could provide Ukraine with enough weapons to win this war. But we're doing all those other things as well. And Ukraine is certainly below Israel in the pecking order of the US empire, the Washington Empire. So I don't see any reason to assess that this is ever going to go Zelensky's way or kind of get him to where he wants to go. All right, next up here, we are getting into Gaza news, and I kind of want to take some time. I got a few stories here to break down the different prongs of the peace deal and where I think that this peace agreement is now in quite a bit of trouble. So this article I wrote for October 16th at the Libertarian Institute. Trump reverses, threatens to kill Hamas if it does not end attacks on rival Palestinian groups. And so this was interesting because the first week after the ceasefire, the Israeli forces withdraw, but there's some other issues here. It's not just the Israeli forces that have been occupying Gaza. They propped up a few Palestinian gangs that have taken control. They've stolen aid. They've killed people. As Trump said, these are some nasty groups. Hamas is also a nasty group. And so when you leave nasty groups together and they're armed and one group is going to take control, well, the bigger one's going to win. And that seems to be what happens. Street fighting, Hamas is taking out these groups. And at first Trump says, well, you know, I'm Hamas on this one. Look what I did in Washington, D.C. Sometimes you got to take out the violent gangs and you got to get your hands dirty to do it. And I was like, wow, you know, maybe Trump really wants to see this thing through. Maybe this isn't just about public relations, saying the right thing or doing what Israel wants, but he has something of a true understanding of the issue at hand here and understands that there can't be a power vacuum and that these other gangs, just because they've been backed by Israel, are not, great people and that they've been stealing aid. And so Hamas is just doing what Hamas does, and we're going to let them do it in order to preserve the peace deal. Couple days later, Trump says, if Hamas continues to kill people in Gaza, which was not the deal, we will have no choice but to go in and kill them. And so Trump has done a major reversal here. My guess this has something to do with the Israeli influence over Donald Trump. Israel wants to use this as an excuse to go back to the fighting. Now, the other big issue here is one of the other big issues here is the Palestinian bodies. This article is one I wrote for the Libertarian Institute on October 13th. Israel halves aid deliveries into Gaza. I've been trying to figure out exactly how many trucks are getting into Gaza, because even when some of them are getting into Gaza, they're entering the strip, they're entering the crossing, but then they have to enter another crossing, right? Because you have the actual border of Gaza, and then you have the yellow line, which is the point to where Israel has withdrew from. So I've been looking at this. I think it's a UN 720 tracker is what it's called. And they track the aid deliveries into Gaza. And so October 10th being the start date, the first week that only 400 aid trucks had not only gotten into Gaza, but had actually gotten their aid to the Palestinians. Now, It's probably like two issues at play here. One, when you have, 100,000 starving people in an area, the first time an aid truck comes in, aid organizations actually store that in a warehouse, right? Like maybe, they'll give like the severe malnutrition food to the hospital and things like that, but they don't just start offering up bags of flour. They wait until they, have 2-3 truckloads of food, enough to feed everyone. This prevents riots and fights and chaos and crush deaths and things like that. They try to flood a region with food rather than let it trickle out like the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation was doing. And this why part of the reason why that was leading to so many deaths and was such an inhumane way to distribute aid. So that could be a part of the factor here, right? That the trucks are there, they're ready to go. The aid agencies are just waiting until there's enough aid. But it seems to me like a hell of a lot less than 600 and even less than 300 trucks are actually making it into Gaza and to the Palestinians every single day. There's other factors at play here. It's all under the control of Tel Aviv. Right, when these settlers are blocking the aid trucks when they leave their warehouses in Jordan to travel through the West Bank and then on to Gaza. I saw one video where, unimaginable, some guy brings his little, 2-3-year-old maybe, in a stroller and sets it in front of a rolling semi-truck carrying aid to force it to stop. I mean, as a father, I couldn't imagine I would risk my daughter's life to stop aid from getting to other people, but these people are really just sick and crazy. So that is the aid is not getting in as prescribed. The Israelis, of course, say, Hamas isn't releasing enough bodies, and that's why we have to do this. It's about pressuring Hamas to comply. I think this is really just Israel trying to look for an excuse to officially break and destroy the ceasefire. The ceasefire does seem to be falling apart. We will see if it will get back together. I believe either Sunday morning or Saturday night at some point, Israel reported that Hamas carried out a multi-pronged attack in Rafah, where I had read maybe 2 Israeli soldiers had died. Now, I read separate reports, too, that said there was no multi-pronged attack. There was one incident in Rafah where an Israeli bulldozer either hit an IED or an unexploded bomb, and that caused either injuries or deaths to the operating team. Now, it's very possible that this was an IED. Doesn't mean was planted in the past 10 days. It could have been there for some time. Hamas said they are committed to the ceasefire and denied any involvement of it. Israel conducted a bunch of strikes, about 24, at least as of the time I wrote this article yesterday afternoon, and killed 48 people, including children and journalists, in those strikes. So Israel appears set to break the ceasefire. Also worth knowing that Benjamin Netanyahu was due in court today to testify in his corruption trial. All right, this was interesting. Kushner, that's Jared Kushner, Donald Trump's son-in-law, Trump believes Israel is getting a little bit out of control. So this was Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff appearing on 60 Minutes. Now, my understanding is that in the White House, Marco Rubio has the most say when it comes to foreign policy. I do wonder if when it comes to the Middle East, Witkoff and Kushner at least have just as much of a say. And it does seem to me that Kushner and Witkoff are probably a little bit personally closer to Donald Trump than Marco Rubio is. And so hearing these two insights on the Gaza deal is interesting. They essentially put forward one of the things that I have said is a possibility. And if we have any hopes of this ceasefire lasting, we have to hope that this is what happened, that Trump became upset with Benjamin Netanyahu after the strike, the attempted assassination on Hamas leadership in Doha, Qatar. Kushner, Witkoff have deep ties, Trump himself, deep ties to these Middle East fiefdoms, and I think really took exception to Netanyahu doing this. And Kushner said Israel is getting a little bit out of control. Witkoff made a very similar statement on the matter and basically said that this was the catalyst for kind of getting a deal done. So interesting remarks there. Next up here, this is an American journalist, Jasper Nathaniel, and he posted on X, "If I am killed in the West Bank, please know that I blame you personally, U.S. Ambassador Israel Mike Huckabee. I was set up by the IDF to be attacked by 100 armed settlers. When I sent the embassy a video and asked for protection for me and everyone else in the Tunisia, they literally said no." And so this is a drop site news journalist. He was going with some Palestinian olive harvesters to begin the olive harvest outside of Ramallah in the West Bank. They were being escorted by the IDF when I guess it kind of looks like they got over this hill. And when they got over the hill, there was a bunch of settlers armed with sticks, rods, and other things, and just started ruthlessly beating the Palestinians, rather than doing what you would assume any police force would do, which is to stop the people assaulting. The IDF just left, and they left this American journalist and the Palestinians to be beaten. One woman was savagely beaten, and I believe is in critical condition. Now, in response to this, he reaches out to the U.S. Embassy and says, "Hey, I need help. I'm in danger. The Israelis, the IDF set me up." And they said, nothing we can do. Now, if you could imagine if there was, say, an American journalist who was with the IDF in Gaza and they came under fire and they called the U.S. Embassy and said, "I need help," I would guess the B-52s would be in the air the next hour and there would be a massive American airstrike on the target. So this is obviously just U.S. policy. We don't care about Americans in Israel. We care about Israel more. Very disappointing. Okay, this article from Craig Murray is an op-ed that we're writing today from antiwar.com. I just want to point out, because Ambassador Murray is a really smart guy, and it's a warning from Lebanon. And he basically says, look at Lebanon. They agreed to a ceasefire with Israel a year ago. Israeli strikes continue in that country day after day after day, hundreds of people killed. There is no ceasefire. Only Hamas agreed to a ceasefire. So anybody who thinks that Israel has now agreed to a ceasefire need only look at Lebanon to see the truth. All right, everybody, that's where I will do for the show today. Let me know what you thought about the format of the show. Leave me a comment on YouTube. Best place to do it. While you're there, if you're not already, subscribe to the channel, give it a thumbs up, and recommend it to some people. And also follow me on X if you don't already. I will be back with another episode of The Kyle Anzalone Show later today, 4:45 Eastern Time. Don't miss it.